Autumn 1448. A woman in a moated manor house in Norfolk writes to her husband, who is away in London on business. She does not ask him to come home. She asks him to send crossbows. Also, the little winches for cranking them, because the ceilings are too low to draw the string standing up, and 2 or 3 short poleaxes. She is not a soldier, and this is not a castle. It is a farm with a court and a rent roll, and she is the one holding it. There is a version of the Middle Ages that most of us carry around without ever having decided to. 1,000 years in which property, law, and money were men's business. A woman somewhere on the scale between a dependent and a possession, handed from a father to a husband, and legally, somewhere below both. It is not a stupid version. It is not even mostly wrong. It is built on something perfectly real. But nobody orders poleaxes for a house they do not command, and the woman in Norfolk was not an eccentric. Across England, in the 12th century, and the 13th and the 14th and the 15th, the person collecting the rents, holding the manor court, settling with the creditors, and deciding what went into which field was very often a widow, not as a curiosity. As a routine administrative fact, recorded by clerks who did not think it worth remarking on. That is the thing worth sitting with. Not that it happened, that it was boring. So this is not the story of medieval England quietly being kinder to women than we thought. It was not. Under English common law, from roughly the 12th century onward, a married woman was what the lawyers called feme covert covered. Her legal personality was folded into her husband's for the duration of the marriage. She could not sue in her own name. She could not make a contract that bound her. The goods she brought in were his to manage. The land she brought in, he controlled while the marriage lasted. In the strictest technical sense, she was not a lesser legal person. She was, for most purposes, not a separate legal person at all. Hold on to that, because everything that follows comes out of it rather than around it. A great estate in medieval England was not a possession. It was a going concern. It had a calendar, and the calendar did not care who was alive. Rents fell due on fixed days. Plowing had a season measured in weeks, not months. Debts came round. The manor court sat when it sat. Service was owed to the lord above, and taxes to the crown above him, and none of those obligations paused for a funeral. And the entire structure of that going concern ran through exactly one person. One name on the charters, one body owing the service, one hand sealing the accounts. When that person died, and men who owed military service died at unhelpful times, in unhelpful places, at unhelpful ages, the machine did not stop. It simply lost its operator, on a date chosen by nothing but chance, and often years before the next operator was old enough to hold a pen. Something had to be standing there by morning. There was no corporation to hold the land, no bank to administer it, no professional trustee with legal standing to sign in the interim. There was one person who already knew what the estate owed and what it was owed, who was physically present on the day, and who the instant her husband stopped breathing, got her legal existence back. The harvest does not wait for an heir. 2 cautions before we go further, because this subject punishes sloppiness. First, everything here is England, roughly 1150 to 1500, and where it is not, I will say so. Nothing about this transfers cleanly to Castile or Tuscany or the Rhineland, which had their own customs and their own arithmetic. Second, the word feudal is a label later scholars attach to all of this, and historians still argue about what it actually describes, or whether it describes anything coherent at all. I will use it because we all know roughly what is meant. It is a convenience, not a diagnosis. Start with the ground, not the law. Take a manor of a few hundred acres in the east of England in the 13th century. There is arable, split into strips across 2 or 3 great fields. There is meadow, which is more valuable per acre than the arable, because without hay the plow oxen do not survive the winter, and without plow oxen there is no next year. There is a mill, which the tenants are obliged to use and to pay for using. There is woodland with pannage rights for pigs. There are a few dozen tenant households, each owing some combination of cash rent, a share of produce, and days of labor on the lord's own land, and owing them on named days that were fixed long before anyone currently alive was born. Now put a clock on all of it. Winter wheat goes in around Michaelmas, late September into October. Miss the window and the yield is not slightly worse. It is a different harvest. Lambing comes when it comes. The hay must be cut in a dry spell in June and got under cover, and if it rots, the oxen starve in February, and the plowing fails in March, and the failure that shows up in March began with a wet week 9 months earlier. Rents come due at the quarter days. The manor court sits every 3 weeks in many places, handling everything from a disputed boundary to a stolen goose to the transfer of a holding from a dead father to a living son. And if it does not sit, those transfers do not happen, and the tenancies go cloudy. Sitting behind all of that is debt, not abstract debt. A knight's equipment, the war horse, the mail, the years of provisions for the men who go with him, was routinely funded by pledging land, and the pledge did not lapse because the borrower died on campaign. Neither did the wool contract sold forward to a merchant, nor the money owed to the abbey down the road, nor the crown's demand for the relief payable when an estate changed hands. That is the machine. It is made of dirt and animals and dates, and none of its parts are aware that anybody has died, which is why the law that grew up around this problem reads less like a moral code and more like an emergency procedure. Magna Carta, in 1215, spends 2 of its earliest clauses on precisely this moment. A widow is to have her marriage portion and her inheritance immediately, and to pay nothing for them. She may stay in her husband's house for 40 days after his death, and within that window her dower is to be assigned to her. 40 days, not a mourning period, a deadline. Roughly the span between a death in early autumn and the last safe day to get winter seed into the ground. The clause exists because somewhere behind it are estates that sat unassigned while the season closed, and the men who wrote it had watched what that costs. The woman in Norfolk knew what it cost. Her name was Margaret Paston, and her family's claim to the manor at Gresham was contested by a neighboring lord with more men and better connections. The crossbows did not save it. In early 1449, an armed force came for the house, undermined the walls of the room she was in, and carried her out. The manor house was destroyed and never rebuilt. Her letters are extraordinary documents, not because she was extraordinary, but because she wrote so many, and they survived hundreds of pages of a woman running an estate under pressure, discussing malt prices and legal strategy and the reliability of particular tenants in the same paragraph. She was doing an ordinary job under unusual stress. That is the correct emphasis. So the constraint delivers its first consequence immediately, and there is nothing anyone can do about it. On the day the landholder dies, real executive authority passes to his widow, and it is not ceremonial. Consider what she is actually holding. She takes seisin of her dower lands, which means the tenants on them now owe their rents to her, and she is the one who pursues them if they do not pay. She holds the manor court, or holds it through a steward answering to her, which means she is the jurisdiction fines for a beast in the wrong field, permission to marry off the manor, the recording of who now holds which strip. She settles with her husband's creditors, because a dead man's debts do not evaporate, and the people owed money are standing in the yard. Where the estate owes military service, she owes it, and must find and equip someone to perform it. She negotiates the wardship of her own children. The service is the part that sounds ceremonial and is not. If the estate owed the crown a knight, the crown expected a knight, a man, mounted, armed, provisioned, and present at a named muster on a named day. Finding him was her problem. Equipping him was her expense. And where a widow could not or would not produce one, there was a cash alternative, shield money, paid in lieu, which meant she was negotiating the price of a soldier she would never meet with an exchequer that did not care why her husband was unavailable. None of this required anybody's permission or approval. It fell on her by default, because the alternative was a functioning enterprise with nobody authorized to sign for it, and medieval English law had no better answer. And the arrangement was not brief. When John Mowbray, 2nd Duke of Norfolk, died in 1432, his widow Catherine Neville took her legal portion of the Mowbray estates. She held it while their son inherited the dukedom. She held it while that son died. In 1461, she held it while the next duke came and went. She was still holding it in 1483, when she finally died 51 years after her husband. She had controlled that dead man's land for longer than he had been alive. Let that land. 3 successive Dukes of Norfolk ran their affairs around a settlement made before some of them were born, on the life of one woman whose death nobody could schedule. And Catherine Neville was not a scandal. She was a well-documented instance of an ordinary structural fact, which historians have studied precisely because the Mowbray records survive well enough to trace what it did to the family's finances. A great estate could be carrying 2 dowagers at once, a mother and a grandmother, each with a life interest, while the man holding the title tried to fund a household, a retinue, and a political career on what was left. Follow that outward, and it stops being a family problem. An heir in that position cannot plan around his own inheritance, because a large share of it is out of reach for an unknown number of decades. He borrows against expectations. He marries for cash. He takes retainer fees from greater men, which is to say he sells his political loyalty, because his land is not currently available to fund him. He litigates his own mother, or his father's mother, over boundaries and waste and whether a wood was felled that should not have been. Read enough 15th century English gentry correspondence, and a pattern emerges that has nothing to do with temperament. These families were not quarrelsome by disposition. They were structurally short of liquid assets at exactly the moments they most needed them, because the arithmetic of succession had parked a large fraction of the estate in the hands of someone who could not sell it, would not release it, and was in excellent health. The estate splits on the day he dies, and it stays split for as long as she lives. Nobody knows how long that is. Everything else in the family's economic life is downstream of that one unpredictable number. If a person has to function as an institution for a term of unknown length, that person needs standing that does not depend on anyone's goodwill. So England assembled it, in pieces, over roughly 3 centuries, out of whatever materials were lying around. The first piece is dower. Under the common law, a widow was entitled to a life interest in a share of the lands her husband had held, most commonly a third, though the fraction varied by period and by region before it hardened. The crucial word is entitled. It was not a bequest and it was not a favor. Her claim did not depend on his will, his family's opinion, or his executor's cooperation, and she had a writ she could bring in the royal courts if it was withheld. A great deal of medieval English litigation is exactly this: widows suing for dower and winning. The second piece runs on an entirely separate track. Down at the level of the unfree tenant, the villain holding his land from a manor, not from the king, the common law did not reach. What governed there was manorial custom, written in the memory of the court and eventually in its rolls. And in many English manors, custom gave the villain's widow something the countess never got. Not a share of the holding, but the whole of it, for life. The peasant widow, in strict property terms, often did better out of her husband's death than the aristocrat did. She paid for it differently. The third piece is jointure, which spreads through the English aristocracy in the 14th and 15th centuries. Land is settled on the husband and wife jointly at the marriage, so that on his death it passes to her by survivorship, automatically, without an assignment, without a writ, and without a fight. It is dower's problem solved in advance by contract. It is also, quietly, how families started managing the encumbrance because a jointure can be negotiated, and a dower third cannot. The fourth piece is the quarantine, that guaranteed window in the house, written into Magna Carta. A physical right to remain standing on the property while the paperwork happens, which matters enormously when possession is 9/10 of everything, and an aggrieved heir is a day's ride away. The fifth piece is a book. In 1405, in France, Christine de Pizan wrote a book of instruction for women of rank. When she reaches the wives of barons, her advice is not about piety or needlework. She tells them that because their husbands will be away at war, at court, on business, they must be able to run everything, and therefore they must acquire the knowledge to do it. Know the law, know the customs of the region, know what the estate actually yields and what it costs. Know enough about arms to command men, to mount an assault and to resist one. That is a management curriculum, written down, for women, in 1405. Nobody writes a curriculum for an exception. You write a curriculum for a role that recurs, that is expected, and that has a known failure mode you are trying to prevent. Christine de Pizan was writing in France rather than England, and she was writing an ideal rather than a survey, but the ideal is aimed at a situation her readers evidently recognized. What that role looked like in practice survives in a Suffolk account book. Dame Alice de Brine of Acton Hall was widowed young and ran her estates for the rest of a very long life. From September 1412 to September 1413, her household book records the year in granular detail. Who ate at her table each day, how many of them, what was bought, what it cost, what came in from her own manors, and what had to be purchased. It is not a memoir. It is an operating record, kept for a woman who needed to know where the money went. There is a modern shape here, worth naming, and only naming. Buying the right to choose your own husband is what it looks like when a control right over your own future has already been sold to somebody else, and you are bidding to get it back, because there is an obvious efficiency sitting in plain view, and it could never happen. If a woman has demonstrably run an estate competently for 20 years, kept the accounts, held the courts, paid the debts, improved the yields, the sensible thing is to let her own it, and let her choose who gets it next. That is not a modern thought imposed on the past. It is the conclusion anyone looking at the accounts would reach. It was structurally impossible, for 3 reasons that had nothing to do with her competence. First, what she held was a life interest. She could take the profits. She could not sell, could not mortgage, could not leave it to anyone. It was carved out of an heir's inheritance, and it returned to him the moment she died. Which produces the predictable result. The person in possession has no reason to invest in the long term, and the person waiting has every reason to police her for waste. The English courts heard those cases constantly. Second, her authority was never a property of her. It was a property of her marital status. A widow was feme sole legally her own person, able to sue, contract, and hold, marry again, and the covering came back down. For the aristocratic widow, her dower lands were not forfeited, but her new husband controlled them while the marriage lasted. For the villain widow, it was harder. On many manors, free bench was held only so long as she remained unmarried and, in a good number of places, only so long as she remained chaste, and the body enforcing that condition was the manor court, which is to say her neighbors, who could report her and take the holding. The entries are short. A widow is presented before the court. It is said that there is a man in her house, the holding is declared forfeit and granted to someone else, and the clerk moves on to the next item, which is a broken fence. No argument is recorded, and no defense is noted, because the role is not there to record arguments. It is there to record outcomes. Whatever the truth of any particular case, the mechanism is plain enough. Her tenure was conditional on her conduct, and her neighbors held the switch. Third, and this is the one that has to be said plainly, for tenants who held directly from the crown, the right to arrange her remarriage was an asset the king owned and could sell. In 1185, Henry II's officers rode into 12 eastern counties of England and carried out a survey. The rolls that survive from it list, entry by entry, the widows and the wards in the king's gift, her name, her lands, what those lands were worth, the beasts standing on them, and how much additional stock it would take to bring the holding up to strength. The woman, the acreage, and the cattle assessed in a single entry so that the crown would know what it had to give away. That is what the record is for. Not to protect her, to price her. The same logic governed her children. When a tenant-in-chief died, leaving an heir under age, the wardship of that heir and the right to arrange his or her marriage fell to the lord, most often the king, and was routinely granted out or sold, which meant a widow frequently had to buy the custody of her own son in competition with strangers, and she did not always win. And the marriage market did not release her with age. Catherine Neville, the Dowager Duchess we have already followed, was married for the fourth time in 1465, in her late 60s, to the Queen's brother, a man young enough to be her grandson. The reason was not affection on anybody's part. She was, as she had been as a girl, a very large landed interest attached to a person, and the person was the negotiable part. Historians disagree, sometimes sharply, about how to weigh all of this. One tradition reads widowhood as the one genuine opening in a closed system the moment a woman got legal personhood, property, and command. Another points at the wardship roles, the forced remarriages and the chastity clauses, and says the opening was a leash with more slack in it. The honest answer is that the question is slightly badly posed because it assumes somebody was offered a deal. Nobody was offered anything. A constraint produced a vacancy, and women stood in it, and what happened to them there depended on how much land was attached and how many men wanted it. So take the accusation from the beginning and hand it back. The charge was that this was an age too backward to permit women an economic existence, that female authority, where it appears, is a heroic exception that slipped through. Every part of that is the wrong shape. Take the doctrine of coverture, the most complete legal erasure of a married woman in the whole system. Coverture is the reason a widow inherited an intact machine rather than a dispute. Because a wife had no separate legal existence, there was no separate estate to disentangle, no partnership to dissolve, no competing claim to litigate. Everything had been fused into one person, and when that person died, the whole fused thing dropped into the only pair of hands physically present and legally revived. The totality of the erasure is precisely what made the reversal total. The doctrine that abolished her is the doctrine that manufactured her. Take the rights themselves, the guaranteed share, the guaranteed window, the promise that no widow would be compelled to marry. Read Magna Carta's clause on that promise again, and notice how it ends. She shall not be compelled to marry, provided she gives security that she will not marry without her lord's consent. That is not a right to refuse. It is a control right relocated. She may not be forced into a marriage. She also may not make one. The clause is not written from her point of view. It is written from the estate's. Take the dowager herself. She was not a beneficiary of the system. She was its shock absorber, the component that kept a working enterprise running across a gap that nothing else in medieval English law could bridge, at a cost that landed on her children, her successors, and frequently on her. And take the last piece of it, the one that sounds most like character. Honor, loyalty, the whole language of medieval obligation. Those were the enforcement mechanism, because there was no other. When there is no reliable court to compel a stranger at a distance, an oath is not sentiment. It is the only contract technology available, none of which means the arithmetic chose everything. It did not. The constraint decided that a vacancy would exist. It did not decide what happened inside it. Some widows ran their estates for the whole of a long life and beat the crown's own officers in the crown's own courts. Others were carried out of the house inside a season by a neighbor with more men, which is what happened at Gresham. Two women could inherit the same problem, in the same county, in the same decade, and end in opposite places. And the difference between them was not the law. It was competence, allies, cash on hand, and whether the man who wanted their land had a patron at court. The arithmetic set the room. The people in it still had to choose, and they chose very differently. The harvest does not wait for an heir, and it did not wait for anyone's opinion about who should be in charge. So what ended it? Not a change of heart. A change in what was technically possible. Through the 14th and 15th centuries, English landholders got hold of a device that solved the underlying problem directly. It was called enfafment to use. Instead of holding land yourself, you convey it to a group of trusted men fiafis who hold the legal title, while the benefit runs to you or to whoever you name. When one of them dies, the survivors carry on and new ones are added. The panel is replaced continuously. The land is never held by a person who can die. In 1425, Richard Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, settled a block of his manors on 13 fefis. 13. Not an heir, not a trustee, not a widow, a standing committee, refreshed as its members died, holding property that had stopped depending on any single life. The arrangement outlasted the Earl by decades and was still being unwound in the reign of Henry VII. Look at what that device switches off. Because the land is not held by the tenant at the moment of death, it does not fall into the Lord's wardship. The crown cannot seize the minor heir's lands or sell his marriage, because technically nothing changed hands. Provision for the widow is written into the settlement in advance, at agreed terms, instead of being carved out by law afterwards. The debts and the bequests are funded from a fund that does not die. Alongside it, a professional layer thickened. Stewards, receivers, auditors, lawyers on retainer men, whose authority came from a written appointment rather than from a marriage. An estate could now be administered by someone whose standing survived the owner. The consequence for the woman in the middle of it is easy to miss, because it looks like nothing happening. She is not removed. No statute strips anything from her. She simply becomes, across a few generations, one provision among many in a document drafted before her husband died, her income secured, her discretion narrowed, her name appearing in the settlement rather than at the foot of the accounts. The roll does not end. It is absorbed into paperwork, which is how most rolls end. Nobody became more enlightened. What happened is that English property law acquired an entity that does not die, and the moment it did, the widow's structural indispensability began to shrink. Her authority had never been a status granted to her. It was a gap in the machinery, and gaps close when something else can fill them. The shape of the underlying problem is not extinct, and it has a modern name: key person risk. An enterprise whose entire operation, credit, and relationships run through one individual, and which has no plan for the morning after that individual is gone. Every succession clause, every deputy authority, every provision naming who signs when the signatory cannot, is an answer to the same question the 40-day clause was answering in 1215. Here is exactly where the comparison breaks, and it breaks in two places. The first is the one that matters most. A modern company survives its founder because the company is itself a legal person. It never dies. Its contracts hold. Its bank accounts stay open. Its ownership transfers as shares while the entity carries on without a pause. A medieval English manor had no such abstraction available. It was a bundle of personal oaths, personal debts, and personal jurisdiction, and every one of those threads had to be retied to a living body before anything could proceed. That is the whole difference. And the enfafment to use is medieval England groping toward the missing abstraction and very nearly getting there. The second break is sharper. A deputy can be replaced. A dowager could not. There was no mechanism to remove her for underperformance, no term limit, no buyout that did not require her consent. Her tenure ended on exactly one condition, and it was not competence. which produced a situation no modern succession plan would tolerate. The interests of the person holding the asset and the person waiting for it were opposed for the entire duration, and neither could buy the other out. The heir wanted the land improved and released. She had every reason to take the income and spend nothing on a property she would never own. Both were behaving rationally. The structure made them opponents. Which is why the aristocratic families of 15th century England spent so much energy on jointures, settlements, and enfeoffments. They were not trying to be generous to their widows, and they were not trying to cheat them. They were trying to make the arithmetic predictable. So, the answer to how women ran feudal estates is that the question contains a hidden assumption worth removing. They were not admitted. No door opened. A system that had fused a household's entire legal existence into one man produced, every time that man died, an interval that nothing else could cover, and the person standing in it had the knowledge, the presence, and, from that morning, the legal capacity. They took rents. They held courts. They pursued debtors, and were pursued. They equipped soldiers they would never see again. They kept accounts down to the last loaf, argued with millers, buried husbands, and outlived heirs. They negotiated with the exchequer for children the crown had already priced. They did it under a law that regarded a married woman as invisible, and they did it because that same law made a widow the only thing left in the room with a name on it, not a promotion, a vacancy. Nobody made space for her. There was a job that could not wait, and no one else the law could hand it to. That is what it costs when the owner of a thing is a person. Next time, what it costs when the thing you own is a promise, and the only object holding it together is a stick of hazelwood, notched, and split down the middle.